Thank you so much, Andreas. And thanks a lot to all the organizers, the staff members, and student helpers who make this fantastic event possible. When I was listening to Andreas' announcement about the train and the emergency, and the worries, and to ask everyone to calm down, it almost like my campus last week. Okay. We had a class boycott because of the ongoing social movement in Hong Kong, and we were worried that the subway station would shut down. So that literally reminded me of about what I was doing. So from Hong Kong to Bremen, you have our sympathy and solidarity. We are in the same boat. It's not just a purely digital world. We have to deal with the actual real world, politics included. So because of you probably know Hong Kong had a very unusual summer. And even though I got the invitation a long time ago, and I'm extremely honored and humbled, but I did not have enough time to prepare. So what I'm going to share today is still preliminary ideas, I hope, that won't sound too incoherent to everyone here today. So it's about China, okay, and which is fetish when we talk about data and power in today's world and AI. It's almost like, I would say, almost like Japan, what Japan used to be some years ago, if you still remember the so-called Japanese schoolgirl watch column in the Wired magazine. But China, as I shall submit today, is also a very different kind of fetish, full of contradictions, caught in between the iron fist of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and also the invisible hand of the freewheeling high-tech capitalism. For some, China is fetishized as the ultimate black mirror, writ large, with 1/5 of the world population being subjugated as if they are 1.4 billion guinea pigs. For others, it's fetishized as the utopia of neoliberal data economy, smart cities, and miraculous rates of market expansion. Both these fetishized visions are, however, partial and misleading. My task today is to argue against both fetishizations by sharing an analysis that is more holistic and historicized, taking into account China's internal conflicts as well as its interplay with the external world, including matters of insecurity. In so doing, I shall borrow from primary sources and secondary materials in both Chinese and English, which I have accumulated over the years, plus fieldwork and interviews I've conducted with my research team and students from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. This is the largest auditorium on my campus, Chinese University of Hong Kong, which is a little bit bigger than this room. Okay, it can hold 3,000 people, and it was packed. Okay, when people here gathered to hear Kai-Fu Lee, the man you see on the stage, to talk about his new book, AI Superpowers, China, Silicon Valley, and the New World Order. The book leads Amazon listings. When you talk about, when you see the most popular books on Amazon, this book leads 3, most popular lists. It's number 3 in AI and semantics, number 2 in robotics and automation, and number 1 in automation engineering. This was as of this morning. Educated in the US and a top AI researcher, Lee held executive positions in Apple and Microsoft before becoming the president of Google China. After Google left China in 2010, Lee started his tech venture capital business in Beijing, and he remains upbeat about China as a dreamland for AI technology and business. Here, he juxtaposes the Chinese model on par with the US model of AI development. While US has Google, Uber, Amazon, and Facebook, China has Alipay and WeChat Pay, the ubiquitous mobile payment systems, TikTok, the addictive music video app, Pinduoduo, the Chinese version of Groupon, but more powerful, and also the food delivery and shareable bikes business that you see all over Chinese cities, and that you can use through your smartphone apps. Li presents a rosy picture of what's going on in China, and he implies this will be good for the world. For one thing, the rise of China challenges the unipolar world domination by US tech giants. More competition shall work to the advantage of AI researchers in both countries, maintains Li. Americans should learn from Chinese, or they risk losing their leading edge. They need to try harder to get more abundant data, more hungry entrepreneurs, better AI scientists, and the US government agencies need to learn from the CCP, to create more AI-friendly policy environments. That's Li's argument in a nutshell. He categorizes AI into 4 types. Out of the 4, China will soon take the lead in 2 types, Internet AI and perception AI, and becomes equal to the US in developing autonomous AI, while the US only remains its leadership in one of the 4 types, which is business AI. China is catching up so quickly, even surpassing the US, because it has more data. Chinese entrepreneurs are more tenacious, and they use a go-heavy approach that's much more labor-intensive than Silicon Valley's typical go-light approach in product development. There are some truth in Li's arguments, but he is fundamentally wrong in 2 ways. First, he's fixated on this binary opposition between the US and China while forgetting other players, which is commonly seen in influential books. Okay? For example, one of my favorite books, The Platform Society by Jose Van Dyke, Thomas Poyle, and Martin de Waal. Okay? It shares that kind of bipolar world vision. It also ignores the interplay between Beijing and Washington, D.C., including matters of national security that shapes technology on the ground. So these 2 are not completely separated. Second, this view underestimates the internal diversity of the Chinese model, from its historical origins to its present state. Today, I shall argue against both of these mistakes, because they see China as a single, coherent, and more or less insular system, a fetish, a myth, repeated daily in commercial media, which, however, does not hold up to scrutiny. Myth often conceals, for example, critical events, such as this one that happened this March. Okay, it's called 996 ICU. 996 means you go to your work. This is a movement started by programmers in China's, some of China's largest software and e-commerce and AI companies. And they have to go to work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. So that's called 996. And then after they're doing a period of time like this, kind of overtime work, very intensive, they ended up in ICU, the intensive care unit. Okay. So basically, this is a very long and detailed document of legal analysis of Chinese labor law. But then it's put on GitHub, right? So it has nothing to do with the GitHub's coding procedures. It's just talking about how all these Chinese tech companies are breaking Chinese labor law and calling for collective action against this illegal behavior, practice of the Chinese giants. And so it turned GitHub into a new site of labor struggle against exploitation. 10 days after this post went onto GitHub, it got 200,000 stars, or basically likes, in GitHub. And also the official, Beijing's official union, Beijing only have one union, it's like the old, East Germany, unofficial union, and it has a party organ newspaper called Workers' Daily. Workers' Daily actually wrote a lengthy editorial expressing support for programmers to protect their legal rights. Within a few days, we have Jack Ma, okay, there. So above there, these are pictures of people making fun of how programmers look like before they were sent into the ICU unit. But then Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, okay, the richest man of China, started to fire back to say, being able to do overtime is actually a blessing for you guys. Okay? And then so this escalated into the most significant clash of words regarding Chinese programmers' excessive work pressure. Never before has this happened in the history of Chinese technology. This would be something Kai-Fu Lee probably would not have anticipated. Nor would Lee anticipate this new book just published a few months ago by Liu Xiao on Chinese science fictions, avant-garde cinema, and Qigong meditation. This is traditional Chinese meditation. In the first decade of China's post-Mao reform and opening up, the 1980s. These were cultural and social imaginations about technology that reflected the advance of post-socialist conditions, quoting Liu Xiao, which was characterized by ideological incoherence and an ambivalent situation between capitalism on the one hand and actually existing socialism on the other. Indeed, in the 1980s, Chinese information fantasies and their precarious mediation were powerful, joined and also even promoted by China's top scientists and politicians at the time, such as Chen Xuesen, whom you will see, or who was the chief scientist before for China's nuclear weaponry program. And he was actively supporting this fantastic, because he was studying somatic science. So up there you would see Beijing residents doing collective meditation together with a cooking pot on their head. Why they were doing this? Because they believe they will amplify their capacity to receive magic waves, information waves into their brain. Okay, so this was very popular, endorsed by high-level officials, and that's a science fiction about a robot. Okay, from the 80s, and so these were this kind of imaginations, social cultural imaginations were full of paradoxes prior to China's embracing of the internet and the neoliberal data power formation in the mid-1990s. If we go further back, probably Lee would be even more surprised to see the beginning of China's IT industry of the Maoist era, which was among the largest in Asia. Public accounts often trace the beginning of computers in China to a November 1955 articles in the People's Daily. But internal documents I had access to show that it was as early as 1951, Beijing started to make plans to build its own electronics plant based on Soviet scientific literature, which reported to the pressing needs of the Korean War. The Korean War started in 1950. So 1 year later, Beijing started to form its own electronics plan. Because at the time, the USSR transferred in 3 batches nearly 2,000 MiG fighter jets to China, and China need to maintain them, producing electronic tubes first at the time, as well as Soviet submarines radars, for the common, war cause in Korea. China took up this task, to maintain, manufacture and also do R&D, in electronics domestically. And a leading example of the factory is this one. It's called Factory 774 in Beijing, which was Asia's largest electronics production line in the early 1960s. As you can see on the right, that was a picture from the 60s. If Kai-Fu Lee returns to Hong Kong today, he would probably be even more shocked by seeing how tech-savvy youngsters in Hong Kong are using Telegram, online forums, and mesh network-based chatting software such as bridge fight, to coordinate themselves in protesting, coordinating themselves and persevering for more than 3 months to defeat the pro-China extradition bill. And they continue to defy the authorities using these digital tools of large-scale resistance. Perhaps even harder, for Li to understand is how, despite all the big data, supercomputers, and AI capacities Beijing possesses, how come the Chinese party state failed so miserably in gauging public discontent in Hong Kong? The mistakes are probably not too dissimilar from what Paul Edwards once called the closed world in his 1996 classic. As political scientist John Burns writes, without a fundamental reform of the way intelligence is collected within the party, Communist Party, to permit more diversity, the party will continue to repeat the mistakes from the past, which is going on in Hong Kong now. So this is my main target of criticism, the so-called Chinese model, or should I say the Chinese syndrome, by which it is understood that the CCP enjoys complete social control through data technologies on the one hand, while on the other it benefits from the economic prosperity and military prowess engendered in the new data revolution, reaping the wealth and power while minimizing the social political risk. That's the gist of a mythified China. Contrary to this popular myth, I'd contend that China is not a single, insular, static, and unified system. It has many internal fragments that often fail to connect, as well as many external links that may turn out to be of decisive impact on the way CCP operates. All these fragments and links then evolve over time, responding to internal and external conditions of insecurity. So this process is deeply historical and configurative. In understanding them, we need to ask, we need to see power and, counterpower, okay, using these two lenses that I'm showcasing here. So on the one hand, we need to see they are historical products in their technological materiality and in their social political meaning, both as crucial moments of radical change and critical moments of existing threats, sometimes during wartime, as in Korea and Vietnam, sometimes as with internal turmoil that Beijing has to deal with. But also at the mundane time of banal capitalism in everyday and cosmopolitan consumerism in everyday life. On the other hand, this interplay between power and counterpower is a fundamentally conflictive reality at the global geopolitical and subnational levels, which would include class struggle, okay, between, for example, farmers and workers and the underclass on the one hand. Sometimes I'll call them the information have less. Now they have access to digital technology. But on the other hand, the cadres and the new rich, okay, and through data infrastructures, ownership, and political economy structures, and contentious issues of distributive justice between these two forces that are fundamental fault line of class struggle in China today. But then we can see this almost as the yin and the yang. Okay, the Communist Party is the power on the one hand, and then the counterpower of the underclasses, the information have less on the other. But they also negotiate and compromise, between the elite and the grassroots. They sometimes exchange co-optation for recognition. And other times they would exchange legitimacy for social security. So the two of them are not completely, in a antithetical relationship with each other. So to give a more comprehensive framework, we need to consider these 5 questions when we discuss power and counterpower with Chinese characteristics. First is, what is the goal for these new data systems or technological systems? Second, through what structural performance, structural in the sense of the government, the corporation, but also the civil society has their own structures. And also through what kind of division of labor, economically, socially, and politically. Under whose control? Okay, this is the ultimate when we talk about power and counterpower. And also at whose expense? Okay, the ethnic minorities, the lower classes, female, okay, and the environment, okay, so the who are paying the price. So these are not predetermined answers. Okay, all these questions are being negotiated and contested, and in any given time and space, okay, including in our current era of the so-called AI superpowers, the answers are still in their formative phase, in transition. And as often is the case, they remain to be articulated, to be performed, to be institutionalized. So what exactly is power and counterpower? I draw these definitions from Castell's 2007 book, Communication Power. So for power, that's a very simple, I quote very simply here, but to say more elaborately, okay, Castell sees power as the institutionalized and also structural capacity of a social actor to impose its will over other actors. Media, including digital media and the data power it possesses, are not the holders of power, but they constitute by and large the space where power is decided. So you cannot completely separate media and data from power, institutionalized and structure in an asymmetrical way to impose their interest and values and will on other players. And counterpower, okay, this is Castell's definition, is the capacity by social actors to challenge and eventually change the power relations institutionalized in society. He continues, in known societies, counterpower exists under different forms and with variable intensity. As one of the few natural laws of society, verified through history, asserts that wherever is dominance, here there is resistance to domination, be it political, cultural, economic, psychological, or otherwise, opposed to what they often define as global capitalism. Okay, so very simply, in that framework of Castell's, at the global level, power is about capitalism, okay, the capitalist world system, where the counterpower is against it. This is a visualization of my, my arguments. Okay, so the hierarchical relationship means also the power. Okay, higher power still resides at the global level. Okay, so I'm pointing at Silicon Valley here. It's global change. It interacts with the power in the Chinese context, which is the People's Republic of China, which is CCP. In ultimately, it's a pyramid-like structure. Or more specifically, is a Leninist hierarchical power. And it was formed, if we can remember, the establishment of the PRC was actually a process of anti-imperial, okay, revolutionary, a process, was very much a reaction to the U.S. Sponsored, okay, forces in China at the time, the Kuomintang. So it was a counterpower to the U.S. And after the establishment of PRC, there was also a brief period, not too brief, I would say, from the 60s to the 80s. PRC actually saw Soviet Union as its number one foe. Okay, that's at the global level, the Cold War level. But within the PRC, okay, the national power, would encounter counterpower. Okay, and then the counterpower would also draw from global networks. Okay, even during Maoist era. Okay, and sometimes it's direct confrontation, with the CCP power, but other times it's detract, it's alternative. Okay? So a very interesting question to consider is how the counterpower could be in Beijing, could be in among the red guards, okay, of the Cultural Revolution, or among the Shanzai, the so-called copycat, okay, mobile phone, in the 2000s. How this counterpower actually is not uncommon for them to end up becoming yet another hegemonic power. This is a question that all socialists and progressive technologies need to confront. But here, another important point is that both power and counterpower draw from traditional Chinese culture. It's collectivism and nationalism. It's moral values and translocal networking based on shared identity. So that's a very simple, maybe the most important slide for today. Let me go to more specific examples. Okay, so organizationally, so this is about the beginning of the Chinese techno-nationalism, which is at the very core of Huawei's corporate culture, as well as many other parts of the Chinese data power puzzle. And in this important book by Ivan Feigenbaum, he traced the continuity between Maoist era, from the 50s to the 70s, and the post-Mao era, since the 80s. And then he argued that the origins from the 1950s are still determining, the lessons from the Korean War, for example, are still primary, for us to understand today's Chinese strategic weaponry program. And he even went so far to argue, this was actually based on his PhD dissertation from Stanford, at the heart of Silicon Valley. He actually argued that the model that the Chinese military, this person, by the way, is Chen Xuesen. Okay, he was the top scientist who pushed for this somatic, body, magic waves. And standing next to him is one of the marshals, the PLA marshals, Nie Rongzhen. This photograph was from 1964 when China successfully tested its first nuclear device. And so so this is a repeated pattern from Korea to Vietnam, and we see actually Soviet and US superpowers of the Cold War era actually in their different ways helped breed Chinese counterpower at the national level. But in another sense, Feigenbaum was arguing, quote, organizationally, this national security approach to technology depended on innovation management institutions that coupled top-down Stalinist-style mobilization to structure and incentivize more akin to those in contemporary Silicon Valley. So if you see this, how this team works, it's actually very similar to the way Silicon Valley works, based on initiative, personal incentives, risk-taking, and networks of cooperation among experts. And so there are actually similarities. They actually, Chen himself got his PhD from the US. So he came back, he brought the US American way to organize scientists, very similar to the Silicon Valley model, but for a different political cause. This is probably the best Chinese language book now, talking about one most important factory in Beijing. Now it's called BOE, Beijing Oriental Electronics. It's now the world's leading display maker for smartphones, laptops, tablets, TVs. Okay, this was last year's data. All these, big or small screens. But it started as the Beijing Electronic Tubes Factory from 1950s. And also it started to make semiconductor. It was the largest electronic factory in China from the 50s to the 70s, Asia's largest in the 60s, and now it has 19 international branches, including in Germany. And then it started by emulating Soviets. Okay, all these core members were sent to the Soviets to learn about electronics, manufacture. And then after the 50s, the Sino-Soviet relationship deteriorated, and they started to look west, okay, to US and also to Japan. Japan was actually invited to do its first electronics semiconductor exhibition in Beijing in 1968, which marked the beginning of China's electronic great leap forward. China had a great leap forward for agriculture, a decade earlier in 1958, but in 1968 it had an electronic leap forward. And one of the beginning events was to invite Japanese, to Beijing to do a big electronics show, and also start to import machinery, from Japan. And during this electronic great leap forward from 1968 to 1970, China had about 6,000 electronic factories, employing more than 500,000 workers, especially the so-called Shanghai model, which are factories. They are not owned by the central government or even provincial. They are small district or even a street collective level. Okay, hundreds of people, not the tens of thousands of people. Very small scale, because Mao at the time was preparing for war. Okay, wants to have very distributed way of organizing strategic manufacture, and so this Shanghai model during the electronic great leap forward is very much Maoist in terms of decentralized R&D and manufacture, and it's very different, completely different from the highly centralized PLA model that we just saw. And then in the 80s and 90s, this factory almost went bankrupt, but then it recovered itself, okay, and become really a giant player in the display, LCD, LED market. And it actually learned from both, okay, the Soviet and the US. I'm not repeating everything here, but without the Soviet and US technology, this factory would be very hard to exist. And then here is a quote from an engineer from the Maoist era. And basically he is repeating this in Chinese, we call it 独立自主自力更生, okay, is autonomy and self-reliance. We learn from others, the Soviet or the Americans, but then we rely on ourselves, even though we are under embargo. We don't have the materials, the parts, the personnel, but we just go out and find what we need, and nothing is impossible if you have a political will to do your R&D. So this would be a quote that summarizes, okay, the can-do spirit of techno-Maoism against foreign embargo at the time. Okay, and much of this was not only made for China. These electronic devices were exported to the anti-imperial, the national independence movement throughout Southeast Asia, Africa, right? Then another very interesting development was in the middle of the Cultural Revolution. We had a Canadian comrade. His name is Dallas Smythe. Those of you who study critical political economy must know his name. He came to visit, Beijing before the ping pong players from the US arrived. And he's a socialist, and he visited China from 1972 to 1973, and then he wrote a legendary essay, the so-called "After Bicycles What." It's actually a letter written to a vice chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, to talk about technology development based on his work and conversation with Chinese technology developers in the early 70s. And this is a legendary essay because he insists, Dallas Smythe insists, this is a internal critique, for the Mao, Chairman Mao and his comrades, and he does not want this to be, exposed to the, anti-revolutionary elements. So until his death in 1972, it was not published. So if you want to read this article, I heard you have to copy other people's Xerox copies. And after 5-6 times, the copy became very blurry. This article was probably the most, Xeroxed, okay, article again and again, in the 70s and 80s, and until its publication in English in 1994 in Gubeck's the Blind Spots book. And in 2016, we finally managed to translate it and publish it in Chinese. So it's still, this article is still receiving debates among Chinese, especially political economy scholars who study technology. So here is what basically he was trying to tell the Chinese comrades at the time not to build American-style one-way television system, but to have a two-way, okay, interactive TV system that will be almost like an electronic 大字报, the big letter character posters that are essentially a YouTube, but owned by workers, peasants, and PAA soldiers. Okay, so these were the ideological language of the Cultural Revolution. It's a very radical alternative imagination about socialist technology and its own development criteria, which should differ fundamentally from capitalist yardsticks of individualism, consumerism, and planned obsolescence. I'm quoting from Dallas Mice. So this is, even during the most isolated period of PRC, the Cultural Revolution, we still have these instances of international counterpower solidarity. In this case, between Canada and China. If we look at other important books from this era, we would see Armen Matlat and Segelob's 1983 book, Communication and Class Struggle, Volume 2, Liberation and Socialism. Here, there's a very interesting piece about average workers. This was in the Shanghai model of the electronic great leap forward. Average workers, and then they are training each other and to have their own programmers, electricians who can fix and improve the computers they had, okay, in the early 70s. And roughly the same time of the cyber scene project in Chile, right? And so probably you still know the term about barefoot doctors, okay, during Mao's time. Okay, so these are doctors who are actually, okay, self-educated villagers, who received some training, but also they live with farmers and innovate with Chinese medicine or other Western medicine to meet the local needs of patients. So here is similar. So these are barefoot electricians, okay, who are there to meet the needs of the textile factory workers. In an award-winning article, Wang Hongzhe, assistant professor from Peking University, he contrasts the mass line. This is the Maoist approach to have the average people control top, high-tech technology. This mass line technopolitics of electronic empowerment in the textile factory of early 1970s was contrasted with 1 decade later. China now imported IBM computers, okay, and from the US. But then this computerized disempowerment practice, and the Chinese workers also in textile factory actually were acting like Luddites. Okay, they were refusing to use this newly imported American technology because they feel they were disempowered. And so these are the kind of subnational conflicts now we see more and more at the city or the organizational level are much more important than how we can understand China at the national level. Okay, but remember China is the size of Europe, right? So we need to have these subnational nuances. And another legacy from the Maoist era that is still going on today is the so-called 儿童电脑大赛, the adolescents computer and technology innovation contest. It started in 1984 when Jiang Zemin, if you still remember, he was the most top president of CCP for a long time after 1989. But in 1984, he was still the minister of electronic industry. So he inherited this, and this is a large-scale competition, and now it's the largest technology innovation context in the entire Asia. And then they would, on the top is, these are the winners of this year. Okay, these are student 16-year student who invented a sensor so that to prevent heart attack when you are doing exercise. I'm still wondering how can you wear all this device when you are doing exercise. But on the right-hand side is actually Chinese language programming. So you don't need to learn English. Okay, you can use Chinese language program to do that, and there are 7 ways to do Chinese language, and then they were teaching the kids to use Chinese language to do programming. And here are ethnic minorities. Okay, this is a legacy. Okay, from the Maoist era, so that average people can learn about technology. Is the legacy from the Maoist mass line, which is still ongoing today. And then into the more recent decade, here we see the post-socialist imaginations and the practices that betray this doctrine of autonomy and self-reliance from Mao's era. And I will start from the top right corner, 1987. That's the first email ever sent from China. It was not written in Chinese. It was actually written in German first, and then in English second. You can read the German better than I, probably. And it was sent from Beijing to Karlsruhe, right? And that's the first, and it reads across the Great Wall. Okay, we can reach every corner in the world. Okay, it's actually very cosmopolitan. Not nationalistic. Not about autonomy and self-reliance at all. Right? And then the German-Chinese cooperation. Okay, building on but also reprogramming. Maoist legacies. Okay, some of these. On the right-hand side, these were in the 80s was still a transitional period, right? And then it's not only in Beijing, but also in Shenzhen, now the so-called Silicon Valley of hardware in the world, right next to Hong Kong. And you will see the oil painting village, the so-called creative industry, and also transporter counterpower, as seen in media piracy networks that can see in so many parts of the world, like India or Africa. And here they challenge the global intellectual property rights regime, and they transform itself into a new epicenter of power, in hardware, in software, and content development. And here we also have Foxconn, the world's largest electronic manufacturer for phones and laptops. And probably people in this room still remember the so-called Foxconn Suicide Express, when 14 workers committed suicide within a few months in 2010. So this is, in that book, it's an English book, but translated into German now, and by members of my research team, Pun Nai and Jenny Chen. And they're talking about this suicide is another way of resistance. Okay, and migrant worker resistance against the new domination, entailing a new tidal wave of class struggle since 2010. Here is an active AI village. Why it's called the AI village is because lots of Chinese AI power are actually empowered by workers who used to work for Foxconn in central China, in this city called Pingdingshan in Henan province. And so you'll see the conditions are like an average internet cafe, okay, a decade ago, and people are paid, not necessarily more, than the assembly line workers. And what they are doing is repetitive. They are just adding tags. Okay, on the right-hand side, you can see it's a machine learning about what objects is where. So it's very tedious, and the people also work 996, okay, over there. And so this is the kind of artificial intelligence, okay, in action. And there are many villages now. I only have one slide for Huawei, but in addition to the Meng Wanzhou, okay, the U.S., China, okay, wrestling, over the case. Okay, but the founder, Ren Zhengfei, we need to remember, he for his most important years, from his early 20s to mid 30s, he actually was a telecom soldier in the PLA. Okay, and when Deng Xiaoping decided to demobilize 1 million soldiers, he was among them. So probably he was not even among the best. So he was demobilized. And then he started Huawei in the beginning just to buy telephone exchange imported from Hong Kong and sell them to China in 1987, and somehow it went larger, and is now competing head-to-head with Cisco, which is why there's so much pressure for the U.S.-China trade war, and Huawei is the centerpiece of that struggle. It's about not just China's position, but also U.S. leadership globally in the telecom equipment market. And if we look into the life of Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, he was actually, he did not win many things when he was young and in the PLA. The only thing he won was he was a model soldier for studying Maoism. Okay, that's the only honor he won during those years. And and the one strategy of Maoism is to say countryside, surrounding cities. So you occupy the villages, the poor regions first before you conquer the centerpiece, the more elite. And but then, so if you look at the Huawei strategy, he was kind of replicating that. But on the other hand, he was not. He was actually doing the Huawei strategy was actually the opposite of Maoist autonomy and self-reliance. If you know how Huawei tried to get technologies from US, from other competitors. Right? And also Mao's mass line about empowering the average, the masses. Okay, the Huawei actually, we just talked about Foxconn had 14 suicides. Okay, within half a year. Huawei, by some media accounts, I cannot confirm full of this. Huawei had more than 40 suicides, in the last few years. Okay, and most of these were not reported because of media censorship. Okay, Huawei workers suffered tremendously from this 996 overtime work, and it's a highly atrematical power relationship within the company, and also between Huawei and its market competitors. Not only foreign competitors who come to China, but also Chinese enterprises. I interviewed other enterprises, and they told me endless stories about Huawei using corruption, using all kinds of ways to win the bid, and to outcompete other Chinese enterprises. So in this sense, Huawei is fraught with global, sectorial, and intra-organizational conflicts. Rather seeing Huawei as one unified system in itself. Going to the counterpower side, I need to fast forward a little bit. So these are new forms of digital activism that I call network labor, on par with network enterprise and network states. In 2009, my favorite example, when we talk about this new formation of the network labor that are having activism using digital media against capital. My old example was from 2009, was a sports apparel factory in Fujian province, where workers formed alliance with hackers who used search engine optimization to make trouble for the IPO of that company in New York Stock Exchange. So this is, by my research, the world's first cyber war ambush by the counterpower of factory workers and hackers and against corporate IPO. But if you ask me, the best example now is actually last year in China. We had another major event called the JASIC, factory struggle. JASIC was a factory making welding machines, but also robotic welders. And then there's a major worker struggle, and they were joined by Maoist students on the left-hand side, like Yue Xin, who was Maoist, and then also we see feminist activists like Da Tu, on the right-hand side. She was among the 5 feminists who were in jail 3 years ago in the China's Women's Day of March 8th. This is how Beijing help you memorize Women's Day, by arresting feminists. But then she is also very much fighting for labor rights. And also Yue Xin was involved, made her name actually first as the Chinese version of Me Too in Peking University. Right? So we see a very interesting convergence of labor movement and feminist movement, which used to be very separated, but now they are converging. So, so this is a summary of the fourth line of class, social class. On the right-hand side, we know China has sent a craft to the other side of the moon, okay? And then it has very powerful facial recognition, sense time, okay, technology, and then they had these social credit systems, not at the national level, by the way. This is from Fuzhou at the city level. So the most active social credit experimentation are at the city level. But on the left-hand side, we have the Didi, okay, is the Chinese version of Uber, and by some accounts, every week in China for 2 years, every week there are 3 strikes against Didi, which triggered Wang Hongzhe to call this algorithm-based class struggle. Right? So the workers actually figure out ways to game the system collectively. And caught in the middle is the Central Network Security and Informatization Leadership Group of the CCP, headed by none other than Xi Jinping himself. Okay, he has to juggle between these high-tech and labor demands. To fast forward, this is a new journalism platform in Hong Kong, but it serves investigative journalists and citizen reporters mostly in Hong Kong, Taiwan, but also mainland China. And it's actually powered by blockchain so that the journalists can have their anonymity. Okay, in Hong Kong, we still have triad slug members that attack journalists because of their investigative journalism. So this is a way to protect their anonymity, but also provide data protection for them to fight against press control while earning a decent income. And my last example here is called Transient. Okay, is whose roots is a smartphone company came out from the Shanzai, the copycat. Initially, they were violating the IPR of the smartphone business, but now this is the leading smartphone company in Africa. Right? And it became famous 3 years ago when its facial recognition algorithms were developed for the detection and the beautification of dark-skinned African faces, a market need ignored by all major phone makers, Apple, Samsung, or Huawei. But here is not just, the company is not just for making beautiful selfies for Africans, but also music, Boom Play. If you don't have it, I recommend you to download it, where Techno, this is the high-end brand of Transient, okay, started in Nigeria in 2015, and it's beating Spotify with African content, download, and other functions specifically designed for the African users who are not as wealthy. Okay, on the right-hand side, for example, there's another brand owned by Transient. It's called iTel. These are specifically for the rural users in Africa. And you can see that phone is, the selling point is big battery because the villages does not have electricity. Right? And so my doctoral student, Lu Miao, is now doing her fieldwork in Ghana to study this company. I hope next time you can hear more from her about in what way this Chinese phone company can represent a new form of decolonial technology design. So in sum, at the risk of oversimplification, let me summarize the importance of national security concerns and their shaping of the genes. So this is quoting from Lu Feng, okay, who wrote the definitive book about BOE. Okay, these are the genes of Chinese data power and counterpower. For their relationship, especially at these 4 critical moments. Okay, we can see. Okay, these are critical moments that defines today's data power interplay. First is the early 1950s. I would call it the Soviet birth, okay, of the Chinese model in a more complicated way from the Korean War, followed by the late 60s. So around the time of Sino-Soviet border conflict in 1969, Mao was seriously worried that Soviet would use nuclear weapon to attack Beijing, right? But that's the point when Maoist, electronic great leap forward, okay, 6,000 electronic factories around the country at very lower level of the structure. And then the third turning point is late 1980s, Tiananmen, okay, and also the new internal conflicts and external isolation, which was for this was a new neoliberal term, was the third most critical moment. And then the mid 2000s, okay, since Xi Jinping took over, is the so-called new normal phase, where we see escalation of class struggle and the beginning of the US-China trade war. So this, in this new normal period, which is now, we see lower economic growth, heightened social control, emergence of alternative social movements, labor, feminist, for example, and also the convergence of resisting social forces in ways that are diverse, dynamic, and often unforeseen or unpredictable. Although each phase is unique in this data power configuration, and these four moments are similar in that they are characterized by the interplay between power and counterpower. But we can, again, metaphorically speaking, these are the yin and the yang of the Chinese model. Power and counterpower are not only antithetical to each other, they also necessitate, reproduce, strengthen each other, although in different historical contexts, their specific constitution varies. During the Maoist era, from the 50s to the 80s, the dominant data power within China is a military political complex, which at the global level worked as a counterpower against the bipolar system of the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union. Since the 80s, it metamorphosized into a political, industrial, military complex, where the goals of the PLA still matter, but not as important as IT industry giants such as Huawei, and ultimately it's the CCP political elite who now takes the front seat, for instance, through the Xi Jinping's leading group for network security and informatization. As a result, yes, there is the heightening of social control spatially within and beyond Chinese power through WeChat, Weibo, and the social credit systems that decides whether you have enough scores to buy a high-speed train ticket. But counterintuitively, I also see less effective control among the temporal dimension in preserving, repurposing, and making histories for present-day social struggles and for the direction of future. In this temporal domain, about control of meaning-making over time, counterpower at the grassroots level has become much less obedient and much more assertive. While data power operates almost invincibly in imposing corporeal control over Chinese bodies, the counterpower forces, diverse as they are breaking loose, creating alternative networks and switching on new unforeseen networks of resistance. So what is the Chinese model? Is this the worst dystopia or the best utopia? I hope you are with me in concluding that neither is the case. It is still too early to tell whether China is going to be the ultimate anti-capitalist or hyper-capitalist system. Is Beijing going to succeed to control all the Chinese, or is the Chinese programmers, okay, will stage another more effective, uprising like 996 ICU? And but most important takeaway is that ours is not a bipolar world of the China-US competition. It is a multi-layered conflictive reality that reproduces power and counterpower with Chinese characteristics, by which we mean historical products that are collective, contingent, and cross-border, including interplay with the EU. And finally, I want to conclude with this note on historical continuity, rather than seeing the Chinese emergence as a break with the past. And the continuity really centers on issues of national security, both externally with regard to geopolitics and internally with regard to class struggle being the most decisive factor at crucial moments of change. So about this note, let me quote a German philosopher, Karl Marx. Right? Men make their own history, okay, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances already existing, given and transmitted from the past. The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. Is the Chinese dream of AI superpower going to become yet another nightmare? Only history will provide the answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very sorry, we do not have any time for questions yet. Okay? Our boss, so you have one.
No, I'm just like, oh, I have questions. It's such a good time. But I don't have one.
But most important, before that, I'm really sincere in thanking you. You can download my last book for free, only this month. Okay, so this is my thank you note. I just want to make sure, like. And if you like this book, after you read it for free, you know, I still encourage you to buy it, because I'm going to get a cut from your purchase, and that money will go to DR Congo, okay, the eastern part of Congo, to workers' radio, where they promote, you know, labor rights and environmental justice, you know, in these mining zones that extracts conflict minerals. Okay, so if you like this book, please buy and support international solidarity for a cleaner data economy. Yeah.